Howdy my totally tubular gamers, we're back with another video, and today I got a ranking video for you. It's going to be a fun one, it's going to be a bumpy one, so strap in. Today I'm finally going to talk about some Warhammer 40K. Now I don't think Warhammer 40K needs all that much of an introduction. It's like the most popular tabletop game, and with it being so popular, naturally, there's been a bunch of video games. There's well over 50 Warhammer 40K games at this point. We could be here all day, all night, all week, shit, all month talking about all of the Warhammer 40K games. And as much fun as that sounds, I'm not going to be doing that today, because the truth is that I haven't played a majority of Warhammer 40K games. I haven't even played half of them. There's just so many of them, and a majority of them are strategy games, which makes sense given that Warhammer is first and foremost a tabletop game. But I'll be honest, I'm not huge on strategy games. There's just something about critical thinking in me that don't seem to go all that well together. So the question really then becomes, okay, if you're not really into strategy games, what 40K games are you actually into? Well, I'm so glad you asked. That's what today's video is all about. Today, we're going to be talking about the Warhammer 40K shooters. Now, over the years, there have been a number of first and third person shooters in the 40K series, and I'm going to be ranking them worst to best, giving each one of them a little review and sharing my thoughts. I might not have played all the 40K games, but I have played all of the shooters in the 40K series, and I gotta say, when it comes to their quality, it's pretty up and down. So we're going to be stacking these games up against each other, seeing where they excel, maybe where they don't excel, which ones should you even play, which ones should you avoid, and which ones are actually pretty faithful to the 40K series. You can let me know down below of any other 40K games that really are worth playing. Again, I'm just looking at the shooters, so don't expect to see Dawn of War or Mechanicus on here. If you comment saying you forgot those games, you're a freaking heretic is all I'm going to say. Alright, let me know down below how you're feeling. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. I got the Patreon and the super thanks. I am just a one-man army here. Any support is truly greatly appreciated, especially as I find myself on the unemployment line thanks to Amazon Games rescinding my offer. Fuckers. Anyway, let's get right into the list of the 40K shooters, which is the weakest. Here we have Warhammer 40K Fire Warrior, which released for the PS2 and PC in 2003. Now, this game is interesting for a few reasons. It was, at least to my knowledge, the first Warhammer 40K game to not feature any tactical or strategy elements, just being a straight first-person shooter. It's also one of the rare 40K games where you don't play as a Space Marine, you play as a Fire Warrior. And the last interesting thing about it is that it really sucks, actually. I had heard of this game before making this video, but I'd never really looked into it or tried it myself. After doing both of those, I can tell you this is not a very good game. I was just kind of surprised with how bad it was almost immediately. I should also make it very clear that my experience with this game is with the PS2 version. The PC version just seems like an absolute nightmare to try to get working nowadays. So this game, as the title implies, is about the Fire Warriors, the Tau Empire, and it's about them expanding for the greater good. It feels like they kind of got the atmosphere in the world of 40K down, I think. I don't really know much about the Fire Warriors, but I mean, all of this seems interesting enough. It didn't really grab me all that much, but at least it looked kind of cool. But let's just immediately talk about why I didn't like this game. The gameplay and the controls. So as you can tell, the game is a first-person shooter set in the 40K universe, meaning you fight 40K enemies, you get 40K weapons, and, you know, are usually a badass. But you absolutely would not know that if you played this game. The weapons feel just absolutely awful in this game, and the controls are terrible. They're wildly unintuitive. It's just a terrible control scheme all around, and then the game just doesn't feel good to play at all. The movement doesn't feel good, and the shooting, it really sucks. These weapons are wildly inaccurate. The auto aim is just terrible. You feel basically underwater the entire time, and I'm just kind of baffled with how bad this game controls and feels. We had plenty of console shooters on the PS2 by the time this game came out. Red Faction 1 and 2 were out, which were also by THQ, who published this game, and Killzone would be out like less than a year later, and that game just feels leagues better than this, and I don't even love the control scheme of Killzone. Like, geez, this might be the worst first-person shooter on the PS2 that I have played. It just did not feel nice to control. None of the weapons felt nice. The combat was not satisfying. It was not engaging, and I just kind of wanted it to end the entire time. On top of that, the AI is just terrible for not only the enemies but teammates as well. Like, they'll frequently just stop attacking you, they will seem rather confused, and it just wasn't fun to get into fights with these enemies. This game was just not fun. It felt super clunky and just dated, and not even dated nowadays. Like, even for 2003, this felt incredibly dated. The level design and set pieces are nothing to write home about either. This game, it really just doesn't have much going on. The shooting in the first person shooter isn't very good. Going through these levels isn't fun. The story and world, while it is interesting enough and you gotta, go rescue your leader, the game just falls short in so many different areas that I absolutely cannot recommend this game to anybody. Even the most diehard of 40K fans, don't bother with this one. There really is just a mountain of issues preventing anyone from having fun with this one. I just don't care for it. So, we have Space Hulk Vengeance of the Blood Angels, which released all the way back in '96 for the PS1, 3DO, Sega Saturn, and PC. Now this one's a bit interesting. It is based off of the Space Hulk board game, which is about the Space Marines going onto these giant derelict ships and just killing everything imaginable. And this game is actually a sequel to the 1993 game known as just Space Hulk. That game though isn't really much of a shooter, it's much more of a tactical strategy game. This game, while you can play it entirely from an overhead perspective like a tactical strategy game, you can actually play in first person and shoot enemies. And that's why it's here. Before making this video, I had absolutely no experience with this game, but after putting some time into it, yeah, it is alright. It definitely leans much more on the tactical side than the first-person shooter side, and it plays more like a tactical strategy game. But it's not hard to see just how ambitious this game actually was. I mean, this was all the way back in '96. They had you exploring these giant ships, fighting off gene stealers. In this game, I will say all these years later, it has a pretty crazy atmosphere. Like, it's dark, it's tense, you never know when they're going to sneak up on you, and at times it almost feels like a little bit of a horror game. Obviously, the visuals are very dated, but the game still managed to spook me a number of times. I whip around the corner and there's a gene stealer or a few of them right there and they just mess me up. And speaking of getting messed up, yeah, this game will mess you up. I was just kind of surprised with how difficult this game actually was. You die so easily in this game despite being Space Marines. You sure as shit don't feel like it. You can just get totally fucked up by these enemies, especially if you're not doing like any planning and you're just kind of walking around killing everything. No, you need to actually be rather tactical, keep all your squad mates around, and it's going to take a bit of trial and error. This game actually has a really steep learning curve, to the point that it's so steep that I don't even know if most people can enjoy it. Especially nowadays, you need to be incredibly patient. You need to actually sit down and try to understand all of this game's mechanics. You have to be very tactical. And I think you're going to die a lot in this game. I really had trouble even finishing the first mission, to be honest. There was a bit of trial and error there, and so I jumped around with some cheat codes to the other missions, and yeah, it only gets harder and harder. This game has 43 missions to it, and the game, well, it's certainly not going to get any easier. The game also has a very, and I mean very, slow pace to it, especially when you compare it to shooters at the time, i.e. Doom. This game is moving at a snail's pace. The shooting does not feel that good either. It's clear the focus was more on the tactical side. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, I don't know if it really comes together in this game. The tactical planning side, the actual shooting, the level design, and fighting the enemies, like, yeah, there's nothing terrible about it, but I didn't really enjoy it all that much. It's kind of a slog. It feels like a chore at times. The combat just does not feel all that satisfying. You don't even feel like a Space Marine. You just feel like a slow-ass dude who can get fucked up by these enemies way too easily. And while I think this game totally nails the aesthetic and the atmosphere, and for the time the graphics were actually quite good, I just see very little reason to actually return to this game, especially nowadays. Like, if you grew up loving it, I'm sure you still will enjoy it, but as someone who did not grow up with it, I really had a hard time getting into this game or finding it all that enjoyable. I've played enjoyable tactical games, but this was not one of them. Even the most die-hard of 40K or Space Marine fans might not enjoy this one all that much, so approach with caution. It doesn't seem like a terrible game, but was not my cup of tea, that's all I'll say. And so here we have Space Hulk Deathwing, which initially released in 2016 for the PC. Now, I actually got this game when it came out. I was pretty excited for it. It had been quite a while since an FPS in the 40K series had come out, and so I was really looking forward to this one. I was going to play through it with one of my buddies, but after I got it, played all the way through it, I couldn't help but be a little disappointed. While it wasn't like this terrible dumpster fire, I didn't think it was all that good either. It was a very mid game. It really was just kind of a mixed bag. Something though that this game absolutely nailed was the presentation, the story, and especially the atmosphere. The game does take place on a giant space hulk that's this big derelict ship, and it sees a squad of space marines going in to wipe out a bunch of gene stealers and find out about its technology. The premise, it's pretty solid. This game though, it absolutely kills it with the atmosphere. It's dark, it's moody, it's tense constantly, and you really always feel like you're on edge. It's pretty obvious the gene stealers and really the whole idea of the space hulk is at least somewhat inspired by Alien, and yeah, it really does give off those Alien vibes. So at the very least, they nailed that. They also really nailed the feel of being a space marine. You're this big, hulking, unstoppable force. You're slow and large, but also incredibly powerful, and yeah, this game absolutely does make you feel powerful at times. When you pull out a big ass sword and start slashing these Xenos in half, or you get out one of the many weapons and you're blowing them away, yeah, it does feel good. The combat at times, it can feel a little janky and sometimes rough around the edges, but for the most part, I think all of the weapons feel nice, and fighting the Xenos, it was a pretty fun time, especially when you just get absolutely swarmed by them. That's really when the game is at its most fun, when it gets incredibly claustrophobic and they're just swarming you in a little tunnel, or you're defending an area and they're literally just coming out of the walls and you're just trying to hold your ground and you're really just, again, constantly being overwhelmed. That's when the game is actually a pretty good time and when it shines the brightest. Unfortunately, this game does have a number of issues that really hold it back, in my opinion. I remember a big selling point of this game was the fact that you could play it cooperatively, and I wanted to play it with one of my buddies, and we just never got the co-op to work. He could never join me, I could never join him. We legit never got it to work. I don't know if it's been fixed since then. I know they did a re-release for this game with a bunch of bug fixes and updates. Maybe they fixed the co-op, but I was never able to try this game cooperatively, and we were forced to play single player. And yeah, this game is a bit lacking in single player, really for one big reason. Your companion AI is just not very good. They're dumb as rocks. They'll turn their back to the enemies, they'll just get mauled. Your healer won't heal anybody unless you're directly telling them to. Like, the AI just sucks in this game, and I was basically babysitting them almost the entire game. This game probably is way more enjoyable in 4-player co-op, but I never got to try that. And speaking of broken and buggy, that was this game, especially that first release. There were so many bugs. I remember getting stuck in levels, getting stuck on the environment, enemies not showing up when they're supposed to, having to restart missions. Really, there was just a lack of polish with this entire campaign. On top of that, the campaign, while it is good fun for the most part, it definitely starts to wear out its welcome by the end of it. The objectives and the level design become rather samey. I mean, you're on a space hulk the entire game. I don't expect it to have a ton of variety in the environments or what you're doing, but it definitely started to feel repetitive, especially in the levels where you're just kind of wandering. Like, you're just wandering through so many of these corridors, not even really sure where to go or what to do, and it almost felt like a guessing game at times as to where you're actually supposed to go, and it's like, uh-oh, I just ended up in another tight-ass corridor and I'm being swarmed by Xenos now. I wasn't even supposed to go over here, but here we go again, I guess. At the very least, the sound design is pretty badass. These weapons sound amazing, and when you kill shit, oh, it absolutely sounds like you're really killing it. Overall, I'm just kind of up and down with this game. There are plenty of aspects I like, and there certainly are more good qualities than bad, but I still have a hard time recommending this one. At the very least, it is quite faithful to Warhammer, and there is some fan service here, and it is one of the very best Space Hulk games. I don't know what that says about Space Hulk's quality when it comes to video games, but there is some fun to be had here. I think if you really enjoy 40K, and if you really do enjoy Space Hulk and you haven't tried this one, then it is worth trying. But for the average FPS fan, or maybe you recently just got into Warhammer, yeah, I don't know about this one. You could do a little better. And so here we have Necromunda Hired Gun, which released in 2021. Funny enough, this game was developed by Strerum on Studio, which is actually the studio that made Space Hulk Deathwing. This would go on to be their next game. They're huge fans of 40K out there in Paris, I guess. And while I am a bit mixed on this game as well, I do think it is better than Deathwing. So while this game is set in the 40K universe, it is actually based off of the board game Necromunda. Now, if you don't know Necromunda, it's pretty different from the rest of 40K. There's no Space Marines or anything like that. It's actually about these rival gangs battling it out in this pretty shitty city known as Hive City. So this game, as the title implies, does take place on the mechanized planet of Necromunda, where you play as a hired gun. It's almost like that's the name of the title. Holy fucking shit, bro. I just figured something amazing out. Water is wet as well, Skibbity Rizzler. So yeah, it sees you as the hired gun taking on bounties and looking for this mysterious silver talon. I think the story itself is pretty whatever, but the world is very interesting in this game. It is, again, very different from the rest of the 40K series, and I think the atmosphere is more than solid enough. The game is actually pretty decent looking as well, despite it being a much more budget game. Yeah, it is a good looking game for the most part. I'm not going to say it's all that polished though. When it comes to actually playing the game, it's a first person shooter that very much is inspired by Doom and Titanfall. I remember back when this came out, people were calling it the Eurojank Doom or Titanfall, and that's not completely inaccurate. So it is a very linear first-person shooter that sees you going through levels, taking on bounties and killing just about everything that moves. You get a number of different weapons in this game. You get a few melee ones, but most of them are ranged weapons, and they're not weapons you normally get in Warhammer games, and there's actually some pretty cool ones here. You even get a dog to help you, which can spot and attack enemies. The dog, yeah, that's a cool addition. The weapons actually feel alright in this game. They've got a nice kick to them, they all feel different from each other, and the combat, yeah, it can actually be quite fun at times. The enemies certainly aren't the sharpest tools in the shed, and the general AI is just lacking in this game, but I certainly was having some fun with it. I will say though, when it comes to the actual feel of this game in general, it takes a bit of time to get used to. It definitely has that Eurojank, where it just feels incredibly rough around the edges. Like, there's no real way to describe it unless you've played this game, but if you've played, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where it doesn't feel as smooth as it looks. It kind of feels clunky at times. The game is very focused on its momentum. It actually is rather fast paced. You can run on walls, you can dash around enemies like Doom Eternal, you even get a grappling hook. The comparisons don't end there though. You can actually do finishers once you're close enough to the enemy and they're about to die. You even get health back for this. And while it's not as fast paced as say Doom Eternal, it's a relatively fast paced shooter. I will say while it doesn't feel terrible, it certainly lacks a certain level of polish and smoothness that you would expect from a shooter like this. And yeah, for lack of a better term, it just feels kinda janky at times. It especially feels janky when it comes to the level design and the platforming. There is plenty of platforming in this game and it's not great. If you're someone that really despised how much platforming was in Doom Eternal, oh yeah, you're gonna hate this. I kinda like the platforming in Doom Eternal. It was a nice change of pace. Here, it's just more obnoxious than anything else, and the level design, it really is nothing to write home about. Like most games released nowadays, as you play through the game, you'll get upgrades for your character and weapon and you become stronger and stronger. The game tries to have a few stealth mechanics, and these, yeah, they're just not all that well implemented. Look, the combat, the gunplay, the encounters, the platforming, the movement, it's all good stuff, but it's not great. It doesn't come together like other fast-paced shooters. It doesn't click or have the same flow that other fast-paced shooters have, and it just has a certain level of jank that really prevents me from liking it as much as plenty of other first-person shooters. At the end of every level there is a boss fight, and the bosses, you could take them or leave them. Some are cool, but most of them are pretty annoying. There's actually a good amount of missions to this game. There's even tons of side quests, and the game's pacing is pretty decent. If you just stick to the main quest, you can finish it in probably like 7 to 10 hours, but if you do all the side quests, you could totally double that and get a good amount of playtime out of this game. So in conclusion, do I recommend this game? Yes and no. If you really do like 40K or you're looking for something different in the 40K universe, then yes, I think you're going to pick up what this game is putting down. If you like first-person shooters, I think you're going to be smelling what this game's cooking, but if you're not really in either of those camps, I don't know if I could recommend it. While it doesn't have any massive glaring issues to it, it has a bunch of little things that really prevent it from becoming one of the all-time best 40K shooters in my opinion. But I will say I'm absolutely rooting for this little studio from Paris. Every game they've done has gotten better and better, and I'm sure the next game is going to be their best work. Or their buggiest. There's really no way to know. I know this game was mad buggy when it released, but I only played it just recently and it didn't seem all that buggy. Janky for sure though. And so here we have Warhammer 40K Darktide, which initially released in 2022. Now Darktide was developed by Fat Shark, the people who made the Warhammer Vermintide games. And when this game was announced, I actually was decently excited. Vermintide 1 and 2 were pretty great, and I was always a little bummed that they focused on old Warhammer and not 40K. So the fact that they were making a 40K version of Vermintide, I was like, oh, this is going to be awesome. And then it released. And man, that original release was just awful. It had so many issues and was borderline unplayable on PC. But over the last 2 years, they've really been updating it and fixing it, and it's to the point now where I could say, yes, Darktide is actually a good game. It's a shame that it couldn't have just released in a better state that was more optimized, polished, and, you know, just ran better, but at least we're here eventually. So when it comes to the premise or setup, it sees a group of agents investigating a chaos uprising on this industrial planet. There's a little bit more to it, with you like starting out the game as a prisoner and going through an intro, but I'm gonna just leave the story at that. This is a multiplayer focused game. The narrative is more of a backdrop rather than a focal point, and I guess because it's a live service game, it's a constantly evolving narrative as well. I don't know, I kind of tuned out for the narrative, to be completely honest. I just wanted to kill stuff, and that's exactly what you get to do in this game. It is very much the spiritual successor to Vermintide 2, where you and 3 other players go through some pretty linear levels, killing basically everything that isn't the 4 of you. The entire game can be played cooperatively, and if you don't have real people playing with you, then bots will take over. At least the bots are pretty decent. Vermintide, if you're not really familiar with it, is very comparable to Left 4 Dead in its structure and format, and subsequently Darktide is quite comparable to Left 4 Dead, where it's all about playing through these levels multiple times, where there's a bunch of random factors every single time. For instance, you might play through one level and you go through a courtyard. In that courtyard, you might get absolutely swarmed by enemies, a bunch of big ones show up. The second time you play through that level, there might only be 1 or 2 enemies. Obviously, there's a bunch of moments or set pieces set up in these levels where almost the exact same thing happens every single time, but it's all about that replayability. There are 4 different classes, and the classes are actually quite different from each other. There's a veteran, a zealot, an ogrein, and a psyker, each of which having some stat differences, different weapons, and even different abilities. The characters really do actually play different from each other and have somewhat different play styles. While you do get guns, you'll still mostly be using melee weapons, as ammo is pretty limited, and you'll want to save it for those big moments when just a ton of enemies show up, or one of the really strong ones. But hey, at least when you actually do use the guns, they do feel pretty good. All of the weapons actually feel good. The combat in general is quite good in Darktide. It has a certain flow to it that is very comparable to Vermintide, and there's a reason so many people like the combat and flow of Vermintide 1 and 2. It just felt really nice, and it was fun to go through these levels over and over. This game is secondary objectives, so there is actually even more incentive to replay these levels and find new secrets and level up your characters even further. The game does have like a loot and crafting system, but I'll be real, I just don't really care much for this. I really just wasn't huge on the progression of this game, but I know they've been constantly updating and tweaking things. They've definitely been updating this game. It plays way better than it did when it initially released, when it was just super unoptimized, incredibly buggy, and it ran just horribly. Nowadays, it's just kind of unoptimized and there isn't a ton of bugs. It was a smooth enough experience for the most part, and the presentation is actually pretty good. It's a good looking game, there's a good art style, and the frame rate, yeah, was stable enough for the most part. And I'm sure just like Vermintide 2, they'll continue to update it, add more and more content, and make it a much smoother experience. While we're comparing it to Vermintide 2, I will say something I actually don't like about Darktide is the characters. The characters just feel super generic and have very little personality, which is not how Vermintide 1 and 2 were. But maybe that's just a nitpick. So, should you play Darktide in this day and age where it feels like every other live service game is dying left and right? Well, actually, I think Darktide is one of the good ones. If you like the 40K series and you've got a few friends to actually play this with, then yes, it is good. Is it better than Vermintide 2? Yeah, I don't know about that one. Even though 40K is more my style versus the fantasy Warhammer, even I'll admit that, yeah, Vermintide 2 is the better game. It also has had years and years of updates, though Darktide has not had years and years of updates, and I hope they continue making this game better and better. As it stands, though, I think this is a good co-op game that is fun with friends. By yourself, I don't think I could recommend it, but the dozen or so hours I've had with Darktide, it was a pretty enjoyable experience. When you're with your buddies and you all get swarmed by just tons of enemies and you're doing everything to survive, it can get pretty tense, it's fun, and it even reminds me of the good old Left 4 Dead 2 days. Gosh, I miss Left 4 Dead 2. And so here we have Warhammer 40K Space Marine, which initially released in 2011. So this game was actually developed by Relic Entertainment, the people who made the Warhammer Dawn of War series. They took a break from making a bunch of strategy games to make this awesome third-person shooter hack and slash hybrid that has since become a cult classic. I played this game a bit over 10 years ago and quite enjoyed it then, but what was crazy was I came back to it, and even nowadays the game holds up incredibly well. And outside of the sequel, there's really never been another game like this. So when it comes to the setting and the characters and the story of this game, as the title implies, it's all about the Space Marine, specifically Captain Titus. He and his squad is sent to a planet to go stop an orc invasion, and stop orcs you absolutely will. You just slaughter hundreds, thousands, maybe even dozens of orcs in this game. There is a bit more story to it, especially in the last third of the game when some other enemies show up, but the story clearly is not the focal point with this game. At the very least, it absolutely feels like they nailed the Warhammer atmosphere and vibe. And when it comes to our main character, yeah, he's about as Space Marine as it gets. There's not much of a personality here. It's kill every greenskin. And that's exactly what you'll be doing a majority of the game. It is a mix of a third-person shooter and a hack and slash, but there definitely is an emphasis on the hack and slash combat. You'll just be slashing away at dozens of orcs, and it really is like as satisfying as you'd want it. You get to just absolutely tear these orcs a new one. There's plenty of different melee weapons in this game, but you can of course take them out with ranged weapons. There are plenty of different projectile-based weapons in this game. The weapon roster is actually quite good in Space Marine. All of the weapons feel different from each other. They have a different handle and feel, and they're all fun to use. You actually don't regenerate health in this game. In order to get health back, you have to do certain actions like executions. You also even have a fury meter, which is about as generic as it sounds, but hey, killing orcs really is like always a good time. The game's combat is engaging, it's fun, and it all just kind of clicks. It makes for this unique, enjoyable, and most importantly, entertaining experience. When it comes to this game's level design, it is very video gamey, where it's pretty much just a straight line. There's not all that much to it, but it makes up for it with a bunch of memorable moments, whether it's boss fights or some really cool set pieces like when you get the jetpack. The game really is constantly keeping things interesting. It's got a decent amount of variety, and you would never even have known that this is the only non-real-time strategy game that these developers have ever made. It really does come together to create a solid 8 to 10 hour experience that really didn't get old. The game has a pretty good presentation, and yeah, the game very much looks like a game from that era, but it's still really easy on the eyes, and the frame rate, it was always impressive. No matter how many orcs are on screen, no matter how many you're slaughtering, it still was steady. This campaign, it was so good. But this game came out in an era where there was actually a single player and a multiplayer outside of Call of Duty. This game had multiplayer, and I remember trying it way back in the day, and it was actually better than you'd expect. It wasn't great, but it was unique and something different for the time. But I am fairly certain the multiplayer is now dead, and anybody that was still playing this has probably moved on to Space Marine 2. So all in all, the original Space Marine, it's a pretty great game. It's one of the very best Warhammer 40K series. It's an immensely enjoyable campaign, and it really is some of the most satisfying gameplay from that era. And I think over the last few years, a lot of people really realized just how good Space Marine is. Like when the game came out, a lot of people didn't care for it, saying it was too linear, the environments were kind of generic, and it wasn't innovative. No, it's not innovative, but it provides a very unique experience. I actually like that it's super linear. Not every game needs to be a big open world game or non-linear game. It's okay to have big linear experiences like this. And as for the environments being a bit drab, yeah, that one I can kind of see. Either way, this game is absolutely worth playing. If you somehow have not played it and you like 40K, I would very much recommend you go play it. Shoot, even if you don't really care for Warhammer or know anything about 40K, I'd still recommend the game. It's a very good game in its own right, and it might actually get you into the entire franchise. This was the game that got me into Warhammer. After I played this, I went and tried a bunch of other Warhammer games, and the rest really is history for the Emperor. I wish it was more widely available though. It was released on PS3 and 360, and yeah, that's not exactly widely available these days. At least it's on Steam. You can still buy it on Steam, and that's probably the best way to play it. Either way, very good game. And so here we have Warhammer 40K Bolt Gun, which released in 2023. So this game answered the question that I didn't even know I was asking. What if we got a Warhammer boomer shooter? Well, this is certainly what the ideal 40K boomer shooter would look like. This game is just nothing short of fantastic. You play as a Space Marine and are sent down to this shithole planet and told to basically purge it of everything. Funny enough, it's actually the same planet as Space Marine, and it takes place after, but they don't mention Titus or anything like that. So when it comes to actually playing this game, it is a very old school, fast-paced first-person shooter where you can carry all of your weapons at once. You have to find armor, ammo, and health pickups. You go through some pretty big linear levels where you gotta find key cards to progress, and you kill basically everything that moves. When it comes to the weapons in this game, oh man, this is as satisfying as it gets. Like, this is ridiculously satisfying. I mean all of the weapons feel amazing in this game, from the basic bolt gun to the shotgun to any of the more powerful weapons. Oh, it just feels so ridiculously good. You feel so freaking powerful. All of them have just a huge kick to them. The screen shakes, the enemies get blown into chunks, and it really just never got old. When it comes to the enemy roster, it's actually incredibly varied. You kill just tons of different Warhammer enemies, and there's actually a good amount of fan service here. As you've probably noticed, most 40k games really only focus on one, maybe two types of enemies, not bolt gun. There's just so many different enemies in this game, so many different things to maim, and the combat is just wildly entertaining. It's incredibly engaging, and you really just get to absolutely mess shit up. You get to do ripping and tearing, you're slashing things apart, you're blowing shit into chunks, you can even taunt them, and it genuinely just never got old. When it comes to the level design, like I mentioned, it is relatively linear. It's not like super linear like corridor based, but for the most part the game does a good job of funneling you forward. You'll have to find some key cards to progress, but outside of one instance, I never found myself combing the entire level looking for these key cards. It's pretty obvious where you're supposed to go next. The game has an excellent pace to it, and it genuinely was just a blast through and through. Obviously, when it comes to this game's aesthetic and art style, it very much looks like an old school shooter, and the sprites are actually pretty well done here. The music is great in this game also. It really matches what you're looking for in a setting like this. And the sound design, oh, it just makes the gunplay even better. The developers absolutely understood the assignment here. Feel as powerful as possible. Make the player feel like a fucking boss, and that's exactly what they did. You really do feel like a space marine. You're heavy as shit, you're powerful as fuck. You get shit done, and you kill all of the heretics. Even if you don't like 40k, like at all, you're a hard hater of 40k and somehow you made it to this part of the video, I recommend the game. And if you like 40k or first person shooters, you should have already played this game. But if you haven't, go check it out. You really won't regret it. It's one of the best boomer shooters I've played in recent memory. I've played a bunch of boomer shooters over the last few years, but man, this really is maybe the best of them all. And it's crazy it's a 40k game that's this good. It's maybe the best 40k game of them all. There's only one that I think is better than this. And that game is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, the latest in the 40k series, and in my opinion, the best of the 40k shooters. This game is just so good. I really never thought we would get a follow-up to Space Marine. It just seemed like one of those cult classic one and dones, but when Saber Interactive announced that a Space Marine 2 was happening, I got excited immediately, and after a few really awesome trailers, it seemed like this game was going to be something special, and then it released, and it absolutely is. This is like maybe the best Warhammer 40k game of them all, and that's no hyperbole. This game just gets everything right. So the game is a sequel to the original Space Marine, but you don't really need to have played Space Marine to understand it. It's about Titus and a new squad of Space Marines going up against the Tyranids. There's a few different planets you go to, and when it comes to the actual story, there's really not a lot here. Titus just kind of argues with his squad mates for a while, they kill a lot of the Tyranids, and everything kind of wraps up. It isn't the strongest when it comes to the narrative, but something this game absolutely excels at is the presentation. This game just looks phenomenal. Not only is this easily the best looking 40k game period, but it's a great looking game in general. These environments just look stunning, and it is crazy how many enemies are on screen, and the frame rate really doesn't dip. I was playing this on PC, and I don't have the fanciest PC. I don't got no 40 card or anything, and it actually ran pretty well. The game actually seemed kind of well optimized. It even has FMVs, which I really didn't expect, and these absolutely look great as well. This is just a great game from the presentation standpoint, and if you like the lore of Warhammer, oh, there is so much fan service here, from the environments to the text. Like, there's just a lot going on here. When it comes to the actual gameplay, there is 3 different modes. There's a campaign, the operations mode, which is PvE, and then there's actually competitive multiplayer. There really is PvP here. This game, in many ways actually, it feels like a throwback to the 360 era, where we would get more than just a single player campaign and that was the whole game, or it would just be a straight multiplayer game. We'd actually get both in the same game, no less, and it's pretty awesome how much content is actually here. So when it comes to actually playing through one of these modes, let's talk about the campaign. You can play through the entire campaign cooperatively, up to 3 players, and what are you doing in this campaign? Oh, you're killing things. The game is just as, if not more linear than the original Space Marine. You really are just moving forward, never veering off the main path, and basically killing everything that isn't a Space Marine. The game really tries to retain the gameplay from the original Space Marine. It's a mix of a third-person shooter and hack and slash game with a heavy emphasis on the hack and slash combat. And all I gotta say is it's great fun. While there isn't a ton of depth to the combat, you're not doing all these fancy combos like Bayonetta or Devil May Cry or anything like that. There's still a bit of depth here, but it's also incredibly weighty, it's heavy, and most importantly, it's satisfying as all hell. There's a few different melee weapons and they all have their own unique feel and moveset, and most importantly, they all got their own executions. There's a lot of different executions you can do in this game, and it's actually how you get your little shield back. The way health works in this game is a little different from the original. You have your shield and your health. Enemies will tear through your shield before they start attacking your health. You can actually get your shield back by doing executions, but the only way to get your health back is with medkits. This game kinda does the Bloodborne thing where after you get attacked, if you immediately retaliate, you can get a little bit of that health back, but the game really emphasizes you doing executions. It's a very aggressive game. The game wants you to be incredibly aggressive. Not only does it want you to be aggressive, it really rewards you for being aggressive, but outside of the hack and slash combat, it is also a third-person shooter, and these guns feel great. They're all decently different from each other. There's a good amount of them here, and they're all incredibly satisfying to use. It feels great when you just blow a Tyranid head off. Speaking of Tyranids, that's what you're primarily fighting in this game. You're fighting Tyranids a majority of the time. Chaos Marines show up as well, and they certainly put up more of a fight, but a majority of the game really is Tyranids, and when a lot show up, I mean a lot. Like an absolute shit ton of them show up, and it's incredibly impressive to see. And sure, while not all of them actually attack you at once, you'll still get absolutely swarmed in this game. This game has no problem just covering the entire screen with enemies and saying, okay, good luck killing all of them. The game can actually even be decently challenging. At least you do get an ability depending on which character you are. There's no like Fury mode. It's basically almost the same thing though. And on top of all of this game has some really excellent set pieces and moments. A few of these levels are just so much fun to play through. When you get the jump pack, it is so good. The jump pack is excellent in this game. I genuinely really do love the jump pack. I wish every level had the jump pack. I really do love it. And I love how it sounds. I love how all the weapons sound in this game, and the executions, they sound as brutal as they look. So it took my buddy and I about 7 or 8 hours to finish the campaign, and I thought it was a really polished, enjoyable experience. Like, this was just a really fun time. And then there's the PvP mode, the operations, and these are a bit different. You don't have to play as one of the campaign characters. You can actually really customize your Space Marine, which, hey, that's always been one of the best parts of Warhammer as a board game, so it's pretty cool you can customize your Space Marine, and you go through some really challenging missions. And if you like the campaign, I think you're gonna like the operations as well, and I know they plan on adding more operations levels. And then we have the PvP. The PvP in this game is alright. It's kind of weird that there's no executions, and it definitely shows that the combat could be a bit more shallow without them, but I think the PvP is serviceable. I didn't play like hours and hours and hours of it, but the time I did put into it, I thought it was enjoyable. I really like that we just get all these different modes, and it feels like there's a ton of variety with this game. While I was playing through this game, it just felt like such a throwback to like the 360 PS3 era in the best ways. And I'm not saying it feels dated or anything like that, but as someone who plays primarily modern games, this game really felt like a breath of fresh air. It focuses on having a brisk, fun campaign and tries to give the player as much content as possible. It even has freaking FMVs, like no modern games have FMVs. And what's great is the content doesn't appear to be over for it either. Saber put out a whole roadmap and everything about how they're going to add more and more content. I think the game is just going to get better and better. If you're someone who's even been mildly interested in Warhammer at all, go play this game. If you're someone who's been on the fence about Warhammer, you don't really know anything about it, I think you should go check the game out. It might win you over for the Warhammer franchise. If you're just looking for big, dumb fun, this is also a great game to get. I know there have been a lot of high-profile releases over the last month or two, but this one really might be the best of them all. Like, I just had a ton of fun with this game, and it easily is my favorite 40K game. And that's it for today's video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hope it was what you were looking for. Have you been playing Space Marine 2? Let me know down below. But if you're going to comment down below, you should comment our code phrase. Yeah, it's not just a code word here. The code phrase is for the Emperor, because of course it's for the Emperor. And so with that, I will leave you all to it. Hope you all have a good day. Skibbity Rizzler Toilet.